In our last video, we talked about functions and we used variables inside of functions and we printed those variables out to have an output. So for instance, we called my function here. It came up to our function x equals 5, y equals 10. We printed out the values of x and y. So when we use variables or when we define variables within functions, those become local variables within those functions. So what I mean by that is if we come outside of my function and we try to print x, we know that print x up here inside the function works, but when we run this we're going to get an error because once we step outside of this function, the variable is no longer accessible. It's a local variable. So the way we can combat that is we can turn this into a global variable. The way we do that is we're going to declare this as a global variable, and then we can set the variable within the function. Now when we run this function, we can see that we have access to the variable not only in our function, this first 5, we have access to the variable outside the function, which is the second 5. So while we're on the topic of variables, we need to talk about casting. There are many times that you want a variable to be a specific type. And because Python is an object-oriented language, it uses classes to define data types. Casting is done using constructor functions. So for instance, int, float, string. So we'll give an example of this. We'll set up a to equal 1, b is going to equal 1.1, and c is going to equal string 1. So we know that if we print out each of these, we see 1, 1.1, and 1. I'm going to delete this function up here so that we can see what's actually going on. Now if we typecast these as integers, meaning we're going to turn all of these into integers, the way we do that is we put int and then we put the value in parentheses. So I'm going to do this for each one of these. And when we print this out, it's actually going to turn each of these into an integer, and we know that's going to be a whole number. So we can see 1, 1, and 1. The one that's easiest to see what happened was B. It took everything decimal to the right of the decimal, it took that away, and we ended up with a whole number. It actually turned the string into an integer, so now it's a number. Let's look at another example. Instead of integer, we're going to change each of these into a float. And we know from before a float is going to be a decimal number. So when we run that, we can see that it's put the decimal after each of the whole numbers, including the string, which is turned into a float.